Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Oil and Gas Workers Association podcast. Joining me today is Michael Johns. Michael, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, Matt. Good to be with you. Thank you.
We appreciate you. I was looking over your bio. And of course, you've got some very impressive stuff. You were a White House speechwriter, Heritage Foundation policy analyst. You've been a senior aide to both a governor and a U.S. senator. You've got some real life experience in addition to having written for Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, National Review, appeared on CNBC. It's all the media outlets. You're a well-respected, highly regarded expert and an advocate of U.S. energy independence.
Yep, and that's a studied conclusion, not an ideological one. I really, came down and looked at this. We need to meet our domestic energy expectations and needs, and that energy production is either going to come with U.S. workers, U.S. jobs, U.S. wages, U.S. taxes, or we're going to buy it from abroad, as we had. And one of the great accomplishments of President Trump, in my view, was among many accomplishments that's overlooked, was really making the United States first time self-sufficient from a petroleum standpoint, not needing to rely on what they used to say were Middle East countries who don't like us so much, and concerned about the strategic ramifications of that volatile region of the world, and to provide jobs in the U.S. for the production. We have more than enough petroleum, more than enough natural gas, more than enough coal. And alternative energy, I'm not an opponent of it either. I think it's simply got to emerge on a market basis, and the technology's got to be there. So, it's great as a concept in someone's mind, but if it's not meeting the energy needs and the market demand's not there for it, it's not the sort of thing that can be imposed on us. And it's important to point out, that when you look at criticism that exists, and the U.S. energy industry has been on the receiving end of a lot of unjust criticism, but the United States, from the standpoint of CO2 emissions, if you go from 2005 to 2019, it's actually had a 15% reduction. We emit less CO2 today than we did back in 2005. The real global concern, crisis really, is with China and its governing its governing Communist Party, which has had an 80% increase in CO2 emission during this time, which makes it somewhat ironic that they are emerging as some sort of global tell-all as far as what should be done with the environment, because there's really not a country in modern times that's done more damage to the environment than China.
The environmental moral compass of the world, China, right? And I thought it was interesting that you bring up China for several reasons, of course, because politics is largely tied to China, especially when we look at a global oil and gas industry. You look at China's investment and deal with Iran, a 25-year deal for oil. And as Iran had vowed to double its oil output this year, and in fact, representatives of the Biden-Harris administration have signaled they are willing to lift sanctions on Iran's oil industry and unleash their oil on the world market. But they're still in the midst of a study of federal oil and gas leasing that affects American workers.
We can really connect some dots here in geoeconomics and geopolitics as it relates to Iran, because it's true that Iran does have the domestic capacity to increase its production, but it's also true that we properly have been denying them global access to a lot of global markets with sanctions that we've imposed against them as a product of nuclear weapons development and the designation as the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. I think the American people are very sensible on this issue, and they understand that enriching Iran, the largest state-sponsored terrorism in the world, involved in a nuclear weapons development program that we need to stop, also one of the world's worst human rights abusers, is not in American interests. And that seems to be a tendency of where this administration, the Biden administration, wants to take things. We should not be lifting those sanctions on Iran. That is crucially important from the standpoint of bringing them into alignment on those three key issues.
Absolutely agree. And I have seen that perhaps the Biden administration is willing to walk away from lifting those sanctions on Iran. I don't think anyone over in Iran earmarks their money from their oil industry as not for terrorism, or not to be used for terrorism.
No. Unfortunately, you're dealing with a highly ideological regime that's motivated by, an Islamic extremist ideology, and that's brought them into alliance with a lot of bad forces, not just in that region of the world, but throughout the world.
Sure.
And the magnitude of disruption and terrorist activities that they've been engaged in has been incredibly significant. In fact, it's really, in the last 4 years, one of the first times that we've designated a division of a standing government, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which is their sort of peak pinnacle military organization involved in the support for this terrorism, as an actual foreign terrorist organization. It's typically been reserved more for terrorist rebel movements, but they warranted, and of course, everyone followed the killing of the head of the IRGC that the U.S. led. And honestly, in the absence of that, we were told that was going to be an escalating event with the U.S. and Iran. It's not proven to be that at all, and it shows how this man Soleimani, who the Trump administration correctly took out,
yes,
and IRGC have been so disruptive in the world.
They were, and in fact, earlier this year, President Biden floated the idea and was going to remove the label of terrorist organization from the Houthi rebels, who weeks later, he did do that. And weeks later, they struck Saudi Aramco. Yes. So thus proving that the terrorists are terrorists, and President Biden made a very bad decision.
Yemen, I'm pleased you raised that. I mean, Yemen is one of the almost certainly the greatest. I don't want to diminish what's going on in North Korea. It's so closed off, we don't know the magnitude of it, but let's assume it's even worse than we could imagine. The situation in Yemen is one of the worst human rights crises in the world. And what's so saddening and frustrating about the situation in Yemen is, if Iran were not meddling with the provision of military support for the Houthis, who in turn have been were designated terrorist organization because they're involved in vast amounts of terrorism, and also have launched missiles into Saudi Arabia, including at Saudi Arabian oil fields. Sure. The Yemen conflict may not end completely, but it would not be nearly the magnitude that it is. So this crisis has been almost solely perpetuated by the Iran regime, and that's in turn brought Saudi Arabia in to protect its sense of border security and its interests in the region, and escalated it unnecessarily.
Now, Iran is kind of the geopolitically, right, the hub of the Middle East as far as where the problem lies.
It is, yeah, it's ground zero of the problem. In fact, I would argue that, and you saw this also in some of the successes with the Abraham Accords, that the Arab world has challenges outside of Iran, but there have been some extraordinary steps forward in the right direction also over the last decade or so. And Qatar is sort of involved with Iran and collaborating as its sort of source for its funneling of foreign currencies to evade sanctions. But outside of those two, and some concerns about the human rights situations in Saudi Arabia, for instance, where there's also been some improvements. There's been some setbacks, but there's been some improvements in women's rights in Saudi Arabia, for instance. There's been decent progress, but all of this volatility really just points to the underlying conclusion that after the United States, Saudi Arabia is still the second largest global provider of petroleum in the world.
Certainly.
Followed by Russia, Canada, and China. I think Canada's got a lot of growth potential over the next few years, which is another reason killing off this Keystone pipeline is just a suicidal move, because the petroleum is going to go somewhere. It's simply a question of who's going to extract it and who's going to move it, right? It's almost certainly not going to sit in the ground in Alberta. And
no, it's certainly not.
Yeah. So what we've in essence done, and these are the sort of foolish initiatives that when you look at them on the surface without a lot of explanation or scrutiny, they might make some sense. But when you really get into the details of them, and you consider the fact that that's petroleum that would have been moved, through the upper Midwest, ultimately utilized in the United States or taken down to the South for export out of the Gulf. Now it's almost likely to be sold off through Russia.
It is.
So the same or even greater environmental impact will occur, and we will not be the beneficiaries of the jobs, the profits, the revenue, or the wages to pay our people. Russia will be the beneficiary of that.
Certainly. And we've seen a shift away. And, when we talk about these, you and I were talking before I went back and remembered to hit record. You and I were talking about how sometimes there's so much going on, there's so much information, and we're talking about the problem way up here, when how we probably need to attack this is to just come at it from maybe a level that somebody like me understands. And hey, look,
it's a huge problem, because we do face complex designs, I think, that seek to undermine both the success, the security, the stability, and the leadership of this country. But they're global designs. Many of these negative developments are not happening. Almost all of them are not happening by accident. They're happening by design. There's forces behind them. And we need to have our own proactive initiative to take care of this. Now, energy resources are crucially important, to state the obvious, to any developed economy, to any economy in the world anywhere. And I come back to just the underlying common sense thesis that we are going to consume X amount of energy resources in the year to come. And the question simply becomes one of where we're going to obtain them from. And the America First agenda that I supported over the last several years is important, because it might sound like a cliche, but it solves a lot of these questions. And it says, between the choice of relying on these, with the exception of Canada, three countries that are either prone to instability, or in the case of Russia and China, actually hostile to us.
Right.
Why in the world would we want to go back in that direction? And the Paris agreement that Trump pulled us out of, just if you dive into the details of it, which you have to do, is
Right.
so incredibly flawed. Just for starters, there's no enforcement mechanisms and there's no penalties for violating the provisions of it. So, as is usual with most of these agreements, we would be sort of put in the position of adhering to all of its components because we'd be sued by environmental activists in all probability if we didn't, given the structure of our legal system in the US. Those same environmental attorneys would not bring litigation and would not be able to bring litigation in most of the foreign countries that would be violating them.
You're right.
And so we would end up inhibiting our own development, and other countries would have really no obligation to do that. Additionally, I'd mentioned China's extraordinary growth in CO2 emissions. It does nothing over the next several years to contain China's growth plans. So China is actually allowed to, they would be in complete compliance with the Paris Agreement in expanding their CO2 emissions.
Yes.
So the largest polluter in the world would become an even larger polluter in the world. And we would net say that that's somehow serving a higher end. It's also a very, very questionable and marginally incremental improvement in total emissions that are not game changers, despite the hype that's been put behind them. As far as
what you're saying makes sense to me. It makes sense to most people. Some people do not look into the facts, look into the math, look into what an agreement says. And in fact, the Paris Agreement, Iran is the only country, the major emitter, to not have signed the Paris Agreement, correct?
No, there's a number of countries that are not participating, and it's a UN orchestrated agreement. And our history with the UN is one of lack of enforcement. It's both lack of enforcement and hypocrisy. I mean, Iran, for instance, which is some of the worst human rights conditions for women in their country, has just been appointed to run this women's commission at the UN. China, one of the world's greatest human rights violators, is on the Human Rights Commission, assessing the human rights conditions of countries like our own. This is where the UN, which made a lot of sense when it was launched, in the kind of post-war period,
yes,
with the idea of avoiding major conflicts and with a fairly narrow mission, has had mission creep for decades now, has gotten into a bunch of areas where they're frankly less capable and often failing. And the institutions themselves have become wholly politicized, as has been the case with most international institutions. And we just saw that with the World Health Organization.
Right.
I mean, what an absolute disservice to, they weren't granted entry into Wuhan province on this pandemic, as they are entitled to under the participatory agreements. And they just took China's word that there was no human-to-human transmission, evidence of human-to-human transmission. That was all the way into mid-January, after you had individuals throughout Wuhan who were collapsing from this virus. It was abundantly clear to anyone in that region of China that this was an immensely transmittable and potentially deadly pandemic.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we can tie together that. So China lied about their COVID numbers. They wouldn't allow investigators in. Also, Iran did that.
More than that, too. They destroyed this. They destroyed the samples. Okay, which would have been immensely helpful from the standpoint of both understanding the properties of the virus, and also in the development of the vaccine. We would have gotten started much earlier on it. They shut down the labs that were doing them. There were individuals that were whistleblowers in China that tried to warn the rest of the world.
You're right.
Bold and brave individuals who either disappeared or died under hugely suspicious circumstances. They swept up and bought a lot of the equipment around the world designed to protect the PPE that they subsequently resold at great profit. And most importantly, which cannot be forgotten, is, they allowed flights internationally to leave Wuhan while they prohibited those flights from leaving Wuhan domestically.
You got it.
So they were acutely aware that there were individuals with this highly infectious, transmittable virus that they were putting on international flights, that they were sending into Europe, other places in Asia, and heavily into the United States.
China lied, and it sounds like they continued to obviously intentionally.
Well, the origin, I mean, look, we don't have a final report on the origin, but let me just say I was at least pleased to see that we had, some former senior officials from the Trump administration come out and say, look, there was this P4 lab in Wuhan. It was doing, this high-end gain of function is what it's called, research, which is really not terribly common clinically. It's highly common and a core component of biological warfare.
Right.
And this lab was heavily influenced and heavily run by the People's Liberation Army, the military of China, not exclusively by them, but a heavy degree of presence. And incredibly, we provided millions of dollars in funding to this very same lab, which for the 500 interviews that I've seen Fauci do, where he's contradicted himself on just about everything, no one has bothered to ask what he was doing, putting millions of dollars of US taxpayer money into this P4 lab, the only one in all of Asia that was doing this gain of function research that was considered so dangerous that we really did not even want to really be doing it in the United States.
I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Fauci. So today, around lunch, I was listening to President Biden announce from the White House that the CDC now says that people who are fully vaccinated and outdoors and not around anybody don't need to wear a mask. And I thought, wow, are these the same scientists President Biden is getting information from whenever they talk about climate change? And he says he's going to listen to the scientists.
Well, look, there were individuals in the administration who did get things right. Peter Navarro is one guy, in my view, when I look at his track record, the trade advisor, also a great champion of domestic petroleum production, who had a lot of things right. But let's go through, if you go through Fauci's record, number one, you go back and see his interview with 60 Minutes in January of 2020, where he said, number one, that there was really nothing to be concerned about, nothing to worry about from an American perspective, that masks were ineffective and actually caused more problems than they solved. He then went on later that month to oppose the travel ban, saying internally in the White House that travel bans didn't work. Well, right. I mean, it's the most, anyone with a little bit of walking around knowledge would know that the first thing you do in a state of emergency like this is stop the bleeding, right? I mean, each incremental person that you can keep out of the country is infected, the better off you're going to be, and the less damaging the pandemic or the virus is going to be. He opposed that, and of course he was wrong on a number of the therapeutics. Was wrong, as I recall, on the prediction of the time that it would take to turn around the vaccine, and has been wrong on the schools. I mean, the science. By the way, the science on the reopening in schools is very clear. I mean, there's no you're not going to see anywhere inside the areas of respective clinical expertise, or even in pediatrics, any prominent voices who say that we're doing the right thing keeping these schools closed. The closing of these schools are immensely costly to kids. These are, I mean, as you're older, like a year doesn't seem like a lot of time, but at that age, at a lot of these ages, this is crucially lost time.
Certainly.
And it's gonna be damaging to them.
I'm glad you mentioned that. We're talking about lost time. We're also talking about, where the federal government and state governments have made some bad decisions based upon what we thought the science was. We talk about how it's politically motivated, and how Dr. Fauci has flopped on position when it comes to oil and gas jobs for Americans. President Biden was certainly not opposed to the oil and gas job his son Hunter Biden had on the board of Burisma.
Right, with Burisma in Ukraine.
Yeah,
I always joke, do you think he even knew the capital of Ukraine before he landed on the board of Burisma?
I don't think he did.
You think he could explain the first fundamental fact related to natural gas extraction and production? I highly doubt it.
Not one frack.
When you don't know energy, when you don't know energy, and when you don't know Ukraine, what are you doing on the board of one of Ukraine's largest energy companies, which, by the way, was engaged in a lot of scandalous and scrutinized behavior at that time?
Yes, sir.
Obviously, if that were Hunter Smith would not have been on the Burisma board.
No, Matt Cody wouldn't have been on the board of Burisma. And I'd love to have one of those $50,000 a month jobs. Hey, when you mentioned that, I'll bet you Hunter Biden didn't know that Burisma was Ukraine's fracking leader, in fact.
No, and of course he'll probably, I'm sure he's on record probably opposing fracking in the U.S. like his father said he wasn't, but it ultimately is proving to be.
It just seems that President Biden has been in favor of oil and gas jobs until it was politically wrong to not be in favor of oil and gas jobs, like that it wouldn't win him any votes.
Well, I think it's part of this grand design is the alternative energy, the alternative energy forces that have put a lot of money into American politics. Much of this support, many of these environmental groups in the United States have been backed by China. If you think about it for a second, it makes perfect sense. I mean, if it means that you can get your primary economic competitor in the world to self-restrain its own development and production because it thinks it's somehow bringing the world to an end if it doesn't do that, that makes some sense, while they simultaneously have no such restraints.
We've talked about the Paris Agreement, and we talked about emissions. Producers in the United States and America's oil and gas workers produce cleaner energy than ever before.
Oh, there's been vast improvements over the last decade, and it's one of the reasons you can't even really compare petroleum or coal today to what it historically was. And
right,
there's every good reason to believe that 10, 20 years from now, you would just see continued refinements in that efficiency and in the diminished environmental impact from it. I mean, for us to be able to expand our energy production modestly, but reduce our CO2 emissions by 15% suggests, which is the case, as you know, that we have put a substantial amount of focus on this. We haven't been oblivious to it, whereas our major competitor, in this case China, has just been completely blind and ambivalent to the impact that they're having. They build coal plants in about 2 weeks there.
Yes.
Typical coal plant. They'll put it up in 2 weeks,
So in America, I tell you what, let me just tie a few things together. So China and Iran have a 25-year deal for oil. Iran has been exporting oil, both Iran and Venezuela. Let me back up. Both Iran and Venezuela have been exporting oil to China despite U.S. sanctions on both countries. China lied about COVID numbers. They're already the largest carbon emitter by a fact, almost twice as much as the United States. China lied about COVID numbers. Iran lied about their adherence to the nuclear agreement before. Iran is a sponsor of terrorism. I read a study that said that even a permanent federal oil and gas leasing ban would only reduce global emissions by 1%. Does that make it, when you put all those things together, like as Mexico announced a big new find, as Venezuela's trying to attract foreign investment, as Iran's getting new investment, as China has invested in Qatar's oil and gas industry, which, by the way, Qatar is India's #1 source for natural gas. It seems like a very global plot to kill the American oil and gas industry.
That's right. It's this is the Great Reset. It's really part of its origins and design came out of Davos. I don't, it shouldn't be surprising really to anyone that you put the wealthiest and most powerful elite from all sorts of countries in the same room, that they're going to come up with some plans. Now, they have not been able to execute on those plans. Start with the Tea Party movement.
Right.
And in 2010, that was the end of the Obama administration. It's true that they governed until January 17, but they had no ability legislatively to get anything passed through the House once we took the House and Senate. And then of course laying the ground for the populist campaign of Trump and the unconventional nature of sort of running against the party and reforming the party to some extent. There's a lot more work to be done there, but making some good progress with it. They haven't had that opportunity until right now. And, we're in a position now where, we have, I think, two big questions that are confronting this country, almost questions that cannot move forward comfortably with until we answer. Number one, the November 3 lingering questions. I'm sorry that it's upsetting to some in the media, but we're talking about thousands of affidavits.
Yes, sir.
Right now, as we're talking in Maricopa County, they're engaged in a complete forensic audit that's been ordered under subpoena based on reasonable suspicion and issues in about 6 other states. You look at how that's not just, it's not like there's two different perspectives on it. There are those who sort of looked at it and said, well, gee, this is very concerning. And there appear to be those who haven't even really looked at it in any granular detail. I've not seen a school of thought of people who've looked at it in granular detail and discounted it.
Yes.
Those who I've encountered, including some very intelligent people in the political world on the left, or in the media world on the left, haven't taken the time to read the Navarro reports or to read the SCOTUS filing from your good attorney general down there in Texas.
Yes, sir.
With the Supreme Court that the court unfortunately wouldn't hear. But even in the absence of it being heard, it was a very comprehensive summary of real things that happened. And then the second thing is the origin of the pandemic. This, China's Communist Party tried to sell us this notion that originally it came out of this wet market. They had to back off that because the science didn't support it. Now the latest is they're saying, well, it might have come from some animal to human transmission from animals, down by the Laotian and Vietnamese and Burmese border. That's about 800 miles, probably, 15 hours, 20 hours of drive. And we're to understand that no one gets infected this whole way. And then it just so happens, just within a mile of this P4 gain of function lab, it exists only in Wuhan and no other area in all of Asia, it pops up mysteriously.
Weird.
Um,
I've
it,
so
it defies common sense. It wouldn't, no one would be believing of it at all, except that we've got this very powerful, sophisticated government of China that spent decades manipulating facts to the rest of the world, and they're manipulating the facts related to this.
You're right. So I really enjoy every time I'm in Austin. I love getting to spend time in Austin, and I've never gotten to see the bats fly out from under the Congress Street Bridge, but I don't.
Oh yeah, there's lots of bats down there.
Yeah, I don't think they're 15 hours fast. You know, like 800. I don't know that they're that fast. I'm going to see if it's possible next time I'm down there.
Well, and the bars on 6th Street.
Oh yeah, Austin's a great city. It really is. So okay, whenever we're talking about oil and gas jobs, that is really the focus of this organization. But so many people, there's a lot to politics. There's a lot to pay attention to. There's a lot that I don't see even, and I'm a political junkie. Like, I like politics. I like paying attention to it. The average person who works in oil and gas, heck, the average person, everyday person, has a family, has a job. They want to go to work, come home, spend time with their families, go to the lake, go fishing on the weekend, take their little girl to ballet, or, you know, coach. There's a lot of politics that's involved, and so it's all tied together. When we talk about election integrity, right, and that was one thing you brought up in talking about Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, the Supreme Court didn't hear that case because they said that Texas had no standing. However, and I'm sure that Attorney General Paxton, that he argued this, when we look at a federal government, a republic of the people, I believe, and I want to hear your opinion, Texas does have standing to ensure that there's election integrity. Saying that America.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it wasn't the right decision, but I would say it was a predictable decision. This becomes inside baseball, but I did not feel that these things belonged in state legislatures, not in the courts. The courts are just not inclined to hear, I think, issues of this magnitude. And in a way, when you're also asking the Supreme Court to render a verdict on actual evidence, and that's not the traditional role that Supreme Courts have played either. So if the evidence were stipulated, or if the evidence had been already established in a lower court, maybe you have a chance of doing it. But these were very credible allegations. I mean, like, for instance, when the media says there's no evidence, when you have thousands of affidavits are evidence. They were created for the purposes of evidence. They have no other real purpose. But I feel this has to be resolved. And I have to say, it's been a wake-up moment for me, because even as involved as I've been, you always are under the impression that there are institutions, individuals that are the safe landing ground in the event of a crisis of this magnitude. And we've sort of learned that nobody's minding the store, really. I mean, even if you ask me right now, who's actually managing the global strategy behind this whole thing, it's kind of a state by state citizens initiative. So in essence, it's, Tea Party people, it's MAGA activists, it's some GOP officials, but they're not even all on board. I haven't even heard from the Republican National Committee as far as what their report is on all of this. That's, to me, astounding and not surprising. If I were a federal judge hearing one of these cases, it would be very difficult not to have in the back of my mind, hold it, your own party hasn't really made a comment on a national level validating any of this. Well, why haven't they? That would be that they raised $1.4 billion this last cycle. It would be logically their position to do it.
It's weird that the GOP, that some members of the GOP, that some basically abandoned President Trump and hung him out to dry Um, you've seen that happen in both parties, both larger national parties,
But
both.
we have two parties right now, I think, Matt, that are undergoing substantial transformations in their agendas. You know, we are becoming, the Republican Party, a multi-ethnic party of working men and women. Um, we're Our appeal is broadening in considerable ways. Um, I don't believe we're really losing substantial support in any particular area, but they're becoming the party that represents these global designs
Certainly.
that we're talking about. So if you want to, pretend that 2 or 3 million Uyghurs aren't being held in detention facilities, that that China's not really trying to take your jobs, and they haven't had it, they're engaged in completely ethical behavior in our trade relationship, and this influx of what are going to prove to be tens of thousands, maybe ultimately hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens who don't even meet the base criteria for any degree of status here, are a positive thing on our economy, on our safety and security, on public schools, on jobs and wages, then that's your party, I guess. I mean, but these are designs that are, the immigration alone is predominantly, firstly, it's very inhumane. It's the exact opposite of how it's being represented. It's being orchestrated by traffickers, human traffickers, and drug traffickers. A lot of these individuals are paying substantial five-figure numbers to get up here, and they aren't paying it up front, so they're arriving here with amounts that they owe back to these bad guys in Central America, and then this is kind of the basis under which a lot of the drug trafficking, a lot of the gang activity, a lot of the sex trafficking, all these things take place. And let's remember, even with these unaccompanied minors, no one mentions this question. None of them consented to be brought here. I mean, this idea, and they're not old enough to consent even if they wanted to. If you had a 10-year-old that was found in Greensboro, South Carolina, who had, been from Salem, Oregon, you'd be on the phone with Salem, Oregon, finding the kid's parents and returning.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I like to write a hypothetical piece sometimes on social media that says something akin to this. I sent my 6-year-old daughter with some drug smugglers and possibly rapists this morning to escape the crime in our country. Number one, the hypocrisy in that, the irony in that makes no sense. And some people in this country paint those parents and sometimes mothers as brave and courageous for letting their daughters go with drug smugglers and likely be raped.
The thing is, there's so many assumptions that were presented. Like, number one is even the very assumption that they've been allowed to go. Yeah, in some cases, they may have been a participant in this. In other cases, these are smuggled kids. I mean, you're dealing, and you're going to put them into public schools, not speaking any English, at all sorts of grades. You take a typical high school student, you're going to put them in 11th grade and you speak 10 words of English. It's going to be an obsession just to get a minor command of the English language by the time he graduates, much less anything else. We know this fentanyl and opioid crisis has almost its complete origins in these two major issues we've talked about today. Number one, the fact that the border is open. 95% of fentanyl comes across the southern border. And number two, where's the fentanyl manufactured? Manufactured in Communist China, for profit for the purpose of creating addicts and overdoses among Americans. So we're now dealing with a government that already was labeled genocidal by Mike Pompeo for its treatment of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. It's now documented fact, the primary provider of this very lethal, 100 times as lethal as heroin, opioid that is hitting streets all over this country.
You're right. So China and Mexico have worked together to unleash.
The drug cartels have. I mean, the drug cartels in Mexico at this point almost have the upper hand over the government. They're just as well armed.
Yes.
Their intelligence is just as good.
Yes, it is.
They're very elaborate, and they are heavily integrated into the United States. So, for instance, when they send in illegals and they end up in Chicago or Milwaukee or Cincinnati or Philadelphia, they know where these guys are, and they've got contacts that are in touch with them.
I'm so glad you mentioned. I'm so glad you mentioned their intelligence. Also, the perception that some people have of drug cartels is low IQ, just basic thugs. These are highly sophisticated, well organized, incredibly well run, very intelligent operations.
Yeah, look, I mean, you pointed out for a long time, the left used to point this out. They don't talk much about it anymore, but Mexico and Central America are famous for being, run by elite families, a handful of them.
Yes, sir.
The wealth distribution in the U.S. may not be perfect, but it's a lot more even-handed than it is in these respective countries. And you have a good deal of individuals, who have been running these for a long time. And the first thing they did was stomp out their smaller competitors. So the smaller local traffickers that might have been moving small amounts are, quickly extinguished, and they're taken over by these, corporate style criminal syndicates. That's what we're confronting.
That's exact,ly it. So let's
be clear, that's who, but this administration, you've not heard. If you go back and look, I've been very critical of them during the campaign. I was critical of them during the transition. I'm critical of them now, but I've never said they're dumb or that they don't know what they're doing. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They're just simply serving and facilitating the really bad and evil forces in this world, and
you're right.
It's dangerous.
And I'm glad you mentioned that it's not just some haphazard, reckless, not careless happen chance that these things occur. It's very intentional. It's very coordinated. It's very organized. Now, when we talk about Mexico, and when we were talking about the drug cartels just now, the allegation that former President Nieto had taken a $100 million bribe from drug cartels is out there. I don't know that that's ever been confirmed. It's just one of those allegations that I was aware of. When we talk about Pemex, Mexico's state-owned oil and gas industry, which means the government owns it. There was funding to Pemex from the Obama-Biden administration. And then in 2014 or 2015, Hillary Clinton came in and helped open up Pemex to international investment. And then I want to say that was 2015 because I believe it was the following year that Hillary Clinton ran on a platform that included climate change and talking about downsizing America's oil and gas industry. But she had just worked to open Mexico's oil and gas industry to foreign investment. And that's
and if I recall correctly, I mean, Obama had encouraged, South American countries in their own petroleum development, including in some of the very Atlantic and Caribbean waters where U.S. petroleum developers were prohibited from actually drilling. Yes. Which gets back to my point, is this energy is going to be developed. It's a question of who's going to develop it. And the positions that they put forward from the standpoint of jobs, I mean, your core focus is immensely dangerous. I mean, just here on this Paris Agreement, these are incredible numbers. 400,000 jobs lost if we go into this. About half of those are manufacturing jobs. I mention that because I think manufacturing jobs are so crucially important in this country.
They are.
And there's a lot of overlap with these other issues we've talked about, including the opioid crisis, because psychologically, you get individuals who have a narrow trade that they learn, and those jobs disappear, or they have. These are some of the very demographics that have fallen into this crisis. $20,000 lost annual income for a typical family of four.
Right.
$2.5 trillion right off of our GDP. That's the cost of this Paris Agreement, and the benefit to us. I would
Nothing.
Really.
We get nothing.
Yeah, there's no guarantee. You have no guarantee that even one other country of the world is going to comply by the components of it or the requirements. And if they do violate it, there's no recourse.
I
mean, you can really just imagine that, just on a base level. Like, would a guy running a corner store do a deal like that?
Right. Mike Pompeo said that treaties are only good. They only work if everybody abides.
Enforceable or with trustworthy partners. Yeah, I mean, same with individuals. We used to need contracts in this country because you shook the hand of another individual, and
that's right.
Was your integrity and your reputation in a community, and you would never break that. Then ultimately people started to break it. Then you needed contracts. Then people started to break contracts, and you need courts. And this is kind of the spiraling erosion, really, of the moral fabric of our country that we need to reverse. And there was a lot of greatness in this country that we've lost that needs to be restored. And there were things that were not so great in this country that we've resolved, which is important to say. It's always a complicated story, but we're headed in some very dangerous and concerning directions in my mind. And we cannot be destroying these key domestic job creating, generally high wage paying jobs like that exist with petroleum and natural gas and coal. These are foundational jobs, and you'll find very commonly that, as you well know, the individuals who work in them, their parents worked in them, and it's what they've spent a long time learning, and they love the work, and they live the work, and they don't want to do anything else. That's what they want to do, and you cannot just simply come in and take this away because some academic ideologue has some grandiose global plan to transition this country overnight into some alternative energy economy. That's simply, we're going to likely see progress in those directions, but there's all kinds of question marks on these, on electric cars, just for starters, and on the electric capacity that exists, and the amount of how far these cars are going to go. And I think one thing we've learned, both with energy prices and energy utilization, like if you've ever had your power go off, it's like the most frustrating thing in the world. You start to realize how important it really is as a commodity.
Yes. And of course, we found that out a little bit in Texas for a couple of
with the grid.
Yes. So those failures there. And I've seen some green energy advocates try to say that, the wind energy and, that couldn't have possibly been part of the failure. And so we get into the finger pointing where it's, no, it was that guy. No, it was that guy. Look,
I looked at the Keystone XL impact as well, just to give you, this is damage. I mean, we're at 100 days into this administration, right?
We are
just getting going. And so this is the long-term cost of the Paris community. Keystone XL, it's about 13, it's a little over 13,000 like core jobs, but the total impact with the replication effect of associated jobs, about 60,000 jobs gone by killing this off.
Yes.
It's billions of dollars in income for U.S. and Canadian workers. And these, by the way, were all union labor jobs under negotiation.
Goodness.
So remember back in the days, a few decades back, when this party used to champion that it was the party of labor. It is now the party of killing labor jobs.
You're right.
That's what they've done with this.
That's a very interesting. So oil and gas jobs, I always say, should have bipartisan support. Oil and gas jobs for Americans. And when we talk about how the DNC has largely been hijacked by these more communist socialist ideologues, oil and gas jobs for Americans seems to be a bad idea, but they're not exactly against it as long as it's over in Iran or China, or, they don't relevant those things.
That's my point. I don't know how you look. If you woke up today and decided that the biggest extremists in environmental thinking, you've seen the predictions that have come and gone of our demise from climate change, where we wouldn't even, the world was supposed to be over by now.
I think we still got 10 more years, according to Representative Ocasio-Cortez. So,
but it's important for the American people to realize there's a lot of money to be made here, and it is the primary driving force behind it. I'm not disputing all of the concerns that exist out there. I don't profess to be a climate scientist. And in fact, one of my biggest concerns is when we talk about scientific consensus, that also is a misrepresentation because that consensus is among scientists who have no expertise in climate.
Exactly.
Right? Among climate scientists exclusively, there is considerable debate, considerable disagreements. I mean, the climate scientist who founded the Weather Channel is more dismissive of all of this than pretty much anybody I've encountered. And he might be completely wrong, but he has a decent base amount of knowledge. But what I was going to say is, if you woke up today and you did decide that this was a crisis that required urgent attention, you would not look at the country, the United States, that's had a 15% reduction in CO2 emissions since 2005. You look at the one that's had the 80% increase and leads the world in CO2 emissions. And yet, because of the funding from China that has gone into environmental advocacy groups, that has been consciously directed at exclusively the United States, and the way they have manipulated these multinational institutions and the global sort of debate over these issues, they've been able to essentially evade the most obvious conclusion that anyone would make if they started to just look at this today, which is, if we're going to do something about it, that's where you start. And they're doing nothing about it. And this Paris Agreement, as I said earlier, would actually allow them to exceed their planned CO2 emissions over the next 5 years and be in complete compliance with the agreement. And if they break the agreement, there's no ramifications anyway.
So I need to wrap this up, and I appreciate you being here, and I'm going to thank you again later, because I like to be grateful. Let me tie everything you just said together. President Biden is making decisions based on scientists that are getting information that, number one, don't have any consensus, that are getting their information from propaganda funded by China. Does that tie it all together?
Well, not exclusively. It's global. There are global sources to it. China's very heavily involved. What Donald Trump called the forgotten man and woman is no longer at the table in these deals, and they're going to be on the shorthand of these all of these initiatives and agreements.
Sure. And so while President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris are willing to kill American jobs because of climate change and because of this Paris Agreement, China, Iran, Russia, other countries, Venezuela, Mexico, they keep working. They continue to produce oil and gas. China, being the world's largest emitter, goes virtually unchecked while we kill American jobs. It doesn't do anything for this climate change.
No,
All we
this is
did
all
was
political. This is all political because, you know, in my view, like I said, I mean, if let's take, if you took them at their word, if you said that they really did in fact believe that the world was going to come to some imminent end if we didn't tackle this aggressively, assertively, and immediately, well, you would have China cutting these emissions. There's no, there's some discussion with them vaguely about it. They're not really willing participants in it. They don't subscribe. They propagandize the notion that the end is near, but they don't live by the words they talk. And so this is really one of what's more properly been labeled managed decline, which is
right.
I'm glad you've heard of it because not many people have, but this is an operating thesis that's existed all the way back into the kind of late 20th century, under which many of these same institutions have concluded that the US is in its waning years as a global leader in the world, and that China is an ascending power. We're a descending power, they're an ascending power.
Right.
And that for the foreign policy elite, the challenge is not to try to buck that, what they see as inevitable reality, but to facilitate this transformation in a way that ends up avoiding a global conflict, because these are the sort of historical trigger points where such conflicts often emerge. Now, of course, I reject that completely.
Me too.
I don't think there's anything about China's system that warrants the level of admiration that these guys have for it.
Yeah.
They're admiring the fact that they, as a manufacturing hub, they can get things made and shipped and moved around the world a little more cheaply. But you even these trade deals out, and this was the thesis that never came true with NAFTA because it wasn't quite exactly right. But you get this trade evened out properly, and you get them to stop stealing through intellectual property theft our most valued product lines, and their labor and production costs will go up too. Ultimately matching ours, and then it becomes a fair competition. It's not really now a fair competition.
You're right.
I don't like when I hear people on our side say that we're competing with China, because in my view, we're playing two different games.
I'm so glad you said that. A lot of people talk about free market principles. Let's let the free market. With China's continued investment, not only in U.S. oil and gas, because I believe it was 2013, they went on a $17 billion oil and gas lease shopping spree here in the United States. Of course, when you look at the big three of finances, Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, we don't know who owns the majority of those shares, where they direct their money. We know that their multi-trillion-dollar portfolio around the world says they can pretty much decide who gets the money, who doesn't. We've seen oil and gas producers here in the United States with a lack of funding to continue operating, and then being taken over with this ESG, this environmental, social, that kind of feel-good kumbaya investing.
Well, and the value of the dollar, I mean, it's kind of the one missing link here in this big conglomerate of issues that we confront, is that the one thing that's been beneficial is that for many years, the United States and China had one shared interest, and that was in keeping the dollar strong, right? So they would routinely purchase treasury bonds from the US just to keep the dollar strong, and because treasury bonds are pretty much the safest place for them to put their reserve capital and currency. Now with the development and their exploration of their own state managed, by that I mean Communist Party of China, you almost need to keep saying that over and over again to remind people who we're dealing with. The same people doing the organ harvesting, the same people that have the Uyghurs in the prison camps, the same people that just rolled over the students in Hong Kong, the same people that have been repressing the Tibetans for decades. These same people putting together this cryptocurrency that really is, deserves a lot of scrutiny, and as it relates to their, I think, intended desire to create a separate reserve currency for the world outside of the dollar. And the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency has been not the only, I mean, there's been a bunch of foundations for our economic success, but that's been one of them. And, it's something we need to be glued into and attentive to.
I'm glad you mentioned that. And also, when you said we need to keep talking about this Communist Chinese, party, we also need to talk about Communist Chinese military companies. And President Trump added, I believe, 10 or 11 companies operating either directly or indirectly in the United States that are Communist Chinese military companies. One of those is Sinochem. And in 2013, Pioneer Natural Resources sold part of its Wolfcamp shale play, I believe it was, to Sinochem, which means that a Communist Chinese military company owns part of the oil and gas, or part of our oil field here around Midland.
Yeah, that's really concerning. And the other issue was we mentioned the electrical grid. One of Biden's first initiatives in those 40 executive orders was removing the prohibition that President Trump had correctly put in place to preclude China from being able to supply parts or service to our electrical grid, on the thesis, pretty good thesis, I think, that we don't want to be reliant on China or empower them in the ways that they are developing this kind of power throughout Latin America, throughout Africa, throughout South Asia, where they can turn the lights out on an entire continent.
The Committee on Foreign Investment, of course, that came up again whenever a Chinese-backed wind farm was going up there in South Texas. Now, we know that China and Mexico are working together. Well, people in China and Mexico working to import really high-grade fentanyl that's killing millions of Americans through Mexico and across the border. Now, when you put that with a wind farm down there, not only do China and Mexico control then our energy and the drugs, do those sound like people we can trust?
No. No, this was a government that was founded by Mao, who rolled over tens of millions of people to take power against the Republic of China that moved to Taiwan. If you've been paying even just a little bit of attention, or anyone who's been paying a little bit of attention over the last just year or two, has seen what they've done in Hong Kong.
Yes.
And what they've done in with the Uyghurs, and what's going on continuously in all of these provincial areas, most of which are seeing their historical cultures, their historical languages, their historical traditions, their religions completely exterminated. And it's sickening to me that we are not seeing, you mentioned Iran. Is that not the greatest of all hypocrisies, that we have this Islamic republic that launched a revolution in 1979 on the principles of Islam, that now is almost certainly the strongest alliance with the greatest repressor of Muslim human rights in the world. I mean, we had all these protests all over the place related to Guantanamo Bay, with a few hundred almost certainly guilty Al-Qaeda individuals
Yes.
taken right off of war fields, for whom the evidence was overwhelmingly convincing, and we couldn't place them in U.S. facilities because they would be we'd be required to afford them U.S. due process, which you don't want to do in a combat situation. Here, these 2 to 3 million Uyghurs estimated have done nothing wrong. They're simply being detained because of their ethnicity, their religious affiliation, and this mammoth desire of now President for Life Xi Jinping's
Yes.
Unbelievable undertaking to assimilate 1.4 billion people who, at the end of the day, don't have a whole lot in common. Much like the Soviet Union. I mean, in the sense that the way my political involvement kind of started I was very involved in the Reagan doctrine and trying to bring the Cold War to an end. And that was laughed at back then. The threat was, and everyone knew we had a major threat, but the idea that we were going to bring it to an end was considered high thinking. But we always described it, and I did as well, as an internal empire, the kind of Warsaw Pact perimeter, which was a product of World War II outcome and post-World War II negotiations, and then this peripheral empire that they had developed, in Nicaragua, Cuba, Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, where people were picking up arms and fighting back against this alien military presence and alien ideology. And my thesis then was that all it would take would be 1, maybe 2 victories, and momentum would build. And when you really ponder what transpired, because none of the Warsaw Pact countries really, they became more engaged. They never really fully liberated. This really came from the outside in. And when I look at China, I think it's kind of an important consideration to say, what is our specific plan in the event that these guys are serious about the strategic plan they have in place right now, which is to replace us in all capacities, in military leadership, in space technology and space leadership, this Belt and Road Initiative, which is an unbelievably ambitious restructuring of how global commerce will function, the continued sort of managed decline.
Let me stop you right there. So whenever you talk Belt and Road and this ambitious way to manage commerce, that the Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese initiative, correct?
Yeah, it's been in place for several years, predominantly as Xi Jinping creation, that is designed to pull together a lot of the maritime and traditional transport routes that would afford them control of a very substantial portion of global commerce.
And that was the conclusion I was going for. Is it sounds like China wants to run the world.
Yeah, this is a global initiative, but it's not the sort of one that Americans are accustomed to dealing with. I sort of said, when you saw like Soviet tanks rolling into Afghanistan in 1979, you said like, there's the enemy and they're rolling into Afghanistan. When you saw the missile crisis, in Cuba, that JFK had to confront, that was transparent, evident. Everyone knew who was behind it.
Sure.
This snuck up on us because we have had leaders that we trusted who, and I've had these discussions over a few decades, who told us basically that China's growth was a positive thing, something that should be welcomed, that they would become more accommodating, more assimilated into the rest of the world as this underdeveloped economy grew. And they continue to describe it as underdeveloped, even to this day, whenever it's convenient. And then, of course, they're the world's superpower when that suits and fits them. The reality is, on a per capita basis, they're still far behind us. But on a standpoint of total production and from the standpoint of being a hub of manufacturing and the creation of goods, we are in the rival of our lives, no doubt about it.
When we talk about free market principles and China's investment in Iran and Qatar and Venezuela, so forth and so on, my question is always this: is it still a free market if it's controlled by communists?
No, it becomes more of a traditional state monopoly, and that's largely what we're confronting. So, there's always been this historical hybrid that's existed in this school of thought, but you can't be under illusions about who's in control. I mean,
Right.
oil executives in Venezuela aren't running executives. Maduro's running Venezuela. And there's no doubt who's in control in China, what party's in control, and the odd reality in all these situations of all these sort of repressive, threatening regimes is that they have a very minimal percent of support among the total general public. Meaning you will never see them decide one day to hold a referendum or an election, because they almost certainly couldn't win one.
Well, it sounds a lot like some of the elections that we're beginning to have now. So we need to wrap this up, because I don't know about you, I don't have a very long attention span. When I want a bunch of people who are like me to watch or listen to this thing, I try to keep them a little bit shorter. I'm long-winded though, and you are just a wealth of experience and knowledge. What is the solution?
First, it's for all Americans to get engaged. We're not going to see the solution or change come from Washington, D.C., in my view. Maybe some components of there can be a part of the solution, but look back to 2009, and things looked really bleak in a lot of ways then too, with the direction we were going, and we quickly turned it around. So there's no room for pessimism or to feel that this is not solvable, but don't think that you can hide from it. This is going to touch your life in a real way. This is not hyping or exaggerating magnitude of what we're confronting. These are real jobs. This is real wages. This is a real definitional moment of what sort of country we're going to ultimately live in and have, if we even have it. And if our system of government can be sustained. Reagan always warned us that freedom was one generation away from extinction. And every generation until this one has taken that pretty seriously. But that's the reality. And it's not passed into blood, as you said. It's got to be actively defended against hostile enemies that seek to tear it down. And that's what we're up against.
Yes, sir. Hey, I appreciate you coming on today. I cannot tell you how much Oil and Gas Workers Association is the organization I founded in 2015, like you and I have talked about, to really talk about and represent every person who works in oil and gas, because largely people forget that they're workers. There are people whose families, whose livelihoods are dependent upon this industry, and that our jobs support so many other jobs, that our industry really supports so many others.
It's a very important industry, and they're very valued and crucially important workers in our economy, and they're great jobs. And we want to keep this industry. It's going to evolve. The industry. I'm not here, defending saying that status quo is going to always be the status quo. It's going to evolve.
Right.
but the goal here is not to wipe out our domestic energy industry so that we can have some reliance on these sort of countries that we've, I think, just described are not terribly reliable, and an alternative energy industry that's got to come to the surface through market means. It can't be imposed through governmental mandate. It won't work, and history has shown us that repeatedly.
Right. So, Michael Johns, thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate you. Folks, China doesn't care about American workers. Russia doesn't care about American workers. Mexico, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, they don't care about American workers. And apparently the Biden-Harris administration doesn't care about American workers either. Oil and Gas Workers Association, we care about American workers. We are American oil and gas workers. Join us at ogwausa.com.